The Austin Conference Hall buzzed with quiet anticipation, its sleek, modern design filled with filmmakers, tech innovators, and cultural critics. The air hummed with the promise of bold ideas, but when Elon Musk took the stage, a hush fell sharp and sudden. The greatest story ever told wasn't born in Hollywood, he said, his voice steady, slicing through the stillness. It was lived by a man who owned nothing, wrote no books, and never traveled far from his village. Yet 2,000 years later, his name echoes across the world. Jonathan Roumie sat in the front row, his fingers brushing the edge of his seat, a faint tension in his jaw. He'd come to this cultural and media conference expecting talks on art or innovation, not a discourse on Jesus. As an actor who dedicated years to portraying Jesus, Jonathan had studied scripture, prayed through doubts, and sought to capture the man's essence. But Elon's words, crisp, unapologetic, like a scientist dissecting a mystery, made him feel as if he were encountering Jesus anew. The crowd, journalists, entrepreneurs, creatives, sat frozen, their usual murmurs silenced. This wasn't the tech-driven agenda they'd anticipated. Something heavier was unfolding, turning the polished hall into a crucible. Jesus of Nazareth, Elon said, pausing to let the name sink in, heavy and deliberate. A carpenter's son from a nowhere town changed history without armies, wealth, or power. He did it with truth spoken in love. Jonathan's breath caught a flicker of awe stirring within him. He'd spent countless hours reflecting on Jesus' life, but hearing Elon, a man of cold logic and grand visions, speak with such reverence sent a shiver through him. This wasn't the Elon of headlines, brash and untouchable. This was someone who'd grappled with questions deeper than rockets or code. The room felt charged, every listener poised on the edge of something vast. I've spent my life chasing solutions to humanity's biggest problems, Elon said, pacing slowly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. Electric cars, space exploration, AI. I thought those were the answers. But lately I've seen they're just temporary fixes. The real issue, the one that's plagued us for centuries, was named by a man 2,000 years ago. Jonathan leaned forward, his shoulders tensing. He'd prayed through nights of self-doubt, seeking wisdom to carry his role. What was Elon building toward the audience mirrored his anticipation, their silence thick with questions. Elon stopped mid-stage, his voice sharpening. We're obsessed with creating AI smarter than us. But we ignore a man who showed what happens when divine intelligence flows through a human heart. We're coding consciousness into machines while dismissing the perfect consciousness that walked among us. Jonathan's lips parted slightly, a quiet surge of clarity washing over him. He'd never heard Jesus framed this way, not as a distant figure, but as a mind beyond comprehension, practical and profound. The man who said, "Love your enemies," Elon continued, his voice softening, almost reverent. Can we even grasp how radical that was? In a world of vengeance, tribe against tribe, he proposed the impossible. And he lived it. When they crucified him, he prayed for their forgiveness. The room was so still, Jonathan could hear his own breath, uneven and shallow. He'd meditated on Jesus' final moments, but Elon's words made them feel immediate, a challenge to every instinct. I used to think the greatest minds were scientists, inventors. Elon said, his gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the hall. I was wrong. The greatest mind belonged to a Jewish teacher who never wrote a word, yet his ideas have shaped billions of lives for 2 millennia. Jonathan's fingers tightened briefly, a sense of wonder settling in. He'd sought to understand Jesus through prayer, but this perspective, as a revolutionary thinker, felt like a door swinging open. The crowd remained still, the air heavy with tension, like the pause before a storm. A journalist in the back scribbled furiously. A filmmaker nearby shook his head, grappling with the shift. But here's what stops me cold, Elon said, pacing again, his voice rising. We've tamed the most radical message in history, turned Jesus into a figurehead for our own plans instead of hearing him. Jonathan's gaze steadied, a quiet resolve taking root. He'd dedicated years to sharing Jesus' story, but now he wondered if he'd missed its full depth. Take the Sermon on the Mount, Elon said, his tone commanding. It's not a feel-good speech. It's a revolution in thought. Blessed are the poor in spirit. He means those who know they don't have all the answers in a world of know-it-alls. Jonathan's mind flickered to moments of doubt when he'd felt unworthy. He'd seen those as failure. But what if they were strengths? Blessed are those who mourn. Elon went on not just for loss, but for the world's brokenness, their own flaws, their closest to reality. Jonathan's breath slowed, a spark of recognition igniting. He'd grieved the world's pain, and now those moments felt like a path to truth. And the meek Elon said, his voice firm, not weak, but strength under control, like a horse choosing gentleness. It's power that chooses mercy. Jonathan's chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with insight. The room leaned in, caught in Elon's rhythm, the hall a crucible of thought. But here's the hard part, Elon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Jesus didn't just say these things, he lived them. When they arrested him, Peter swung a sword. Jesus stopped him. A man with infinite power chose restraint. Jonathan's hand stilled, his mind alight, knowing the next words could reshape everything. The Austin Hall pulsed with quiet intensity, Elon Musk's words hanging like a challenge. Jonathan Roumie sat forward, his fingers brushing his knee, a subtle ache of recognition spreading through him. The image of Jesus halting Peter's sword, choosing mercy over, might burned in his mind, vivid and unyielding. The audience, creatives, tech pioneers, journalists, sat riveted, their usual chatter replaced by a stillness that thrummed with questions. Elon stood center stage, his silhouette sharp against the glowing screen, his voice ready to plunge deeper. We glorify those who strike back when wronged, Elon said, his tone measured but fierce. Our films, our stories, they celebrate revenge, power over foes. But Jesus offered something so alien it still feels impossible. Forgive your enemies. Not just those who annoy you, but those who want to destroy you. Jonathan's shoulders tensed, a quiet fire kindling within. He'd grappled with Jesus' call to love, but hearing it from a man known for battling rivals made it feel raw, almost defiant. Elon paced deliberately, each step echoing in the hushed room. I've been wrestling with this, he said, his voice dropping, confessional. What kind of mind says evil is defeated not by force, but by absorbing it, transforming it with love? That's not human instinct. That's something else. Jonathan's gaze flickered. Memories of personal hurts, criticism, betrayals surfacing. The urge to fight back had always been there, but Elon's words sparked a question. Could forgiveness be stronger? The silence was thick, broken only by a faint rustle from a notebook in the back. A young screenwriter nearby clutched her pen, her eyes wide. The tech mogul beside Jonathan sat still, his usual smirk gone. Here's what keeps me up at night, Elon said, his voice cutting through like a blade. If Jesus was just a wise teacher, where did these ideas come from? They defy everything we know about survival. Jonathan's fingers twitched, a nervous energy stirring. He'd pondered similar questions in quiet moments, seeking to grasp the man he portrayed. But Elon's approach, sharp, analytical, made it feel like a puzzle demanding answers. Think about it, Elon said, gesturing as if mapping a problem. Every system, religious or not, is built on balance. Buddhism has karma. What goes around comes around. Islam calls for justice, measure for measure. Modern ethics is about fairness. He paused, the contrast sharp. But Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Turn the other cheek. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of awe and unease. A woman in the second row dabbed at her eyes, her sunglasses slipping. Jonathan felt the weight of those words, their radical simplicity. This isn't just hard, Elon said, his eyes alight with conviction. It's against every survival instinct. You don't win by turning the other cheek. Yet Jesus lived it every moment. Jonathan's breath hitched, his mind flashing to Jesus' trial, the silence before Pilate. Elon's framing made it a deliberate act of rebellion against human nature. And how he spoke of himself, Elon said, his pacing quickening. Teachers point to wisdom. Jesus said, I am the way. Others offer truths. He said, I am the truth. Others teach life. He said, I am the life. The tech executive beside Jonathan shifted his fingers, tapping nervously. The room buzzed with tension, every listener caught. Either he was delusional, Elon said, his tone blunt, or he was exactly who he claimed. C.S. Lewis was right, liar, lunatic, or lord. No middle ground. Jonathan's chest tightened, a quiet clarity settling in. He'd believed in Jesus, but this stark logic felt like a lens sharpening his faith. The crowd was divided, some captivated, others skeptical, yet all glued to Elon. But here's what shook me. Elon said, his voice softening, pulling the room in. It wasn't just his words. It was the people who knew him, fishermen, tax collectors, doubters. They saw him at his most human, tired, frustrated. Elon paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. Jonathan's lips parted, a faint exhale escaping. Yet after his death, Elon continued. These men who fled when he was arrested became willing to die rather than deny what they saw. Not for an idea, but for events they witnessed. Jonathan's hands stilled, his mind racing. The disciples' courage felt like evidence, not just faith. You might die for a lie you believe, Elon said, his voice steady, but not for one you know is false. They knew if they'd seen him alive. The room crackled with the weight of that truth, and Jonathan sensed Elon was about to go deeper. The Austin Hall hung in fragile silence, Elon Musk's words settling like a spark ready to ignite. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward, his jaw tightening, a surge of anticipation coursing through him. The idea that the disciples died for what they saw, not a belief but a reality, felt like a cornerstone, unyielding and sharp. The audience sat transfixed, their notebooks open, but pens still, as if afraid to disrupt the moment. Elon stood center stage, his energy focused, his voice ready to peel back another layer. Let me tell you what I found when I dug deeper, Elon said, his tone measured like an engineer, unveiling a discovery. I approach everything with data, testing assumptions, seeking the simplest explanation. Jonathan's fingers brushed his seat, a quiet resolve stirring. He'd studied Jesus' life, but Elon's methodical lens felt like a new path, both clear and challenging. The crowd leaned in, caught in the same hushed expectancy. Start with what skeptics agree on, Elon said, his hands clasped, gaze steady. Jesus was real. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers claimed he rose, and within decades that belief spread across an empire that tried to crush it. A journalist in the back scribbled, her pen scratching softly. The lack of cameras made the moment feel intimate, a shared secret. The resurrection claim wasn't a legend built over centuries, Elon said, his eyes narrowing. It was made right away by people who could be questioned by thousands still alive. Jonathan's breath slowed, a spark of clarity igniting. He'd read the early accounts, but this framing as a claim open to scrutiny made them feel urgent. A timeline flashed on the screen, stark and precise. The earliest Christian creed, Elon said, pointing dates to within 2 years of the crucifixion. It names his death, burial, resurrection. No time for myths. A tech founder whispered nearby, his eyes fixed on the slide. Jonathan nodded, slightly drawn into the logic. Then the empty tomb, Elon said, clicking to a new slide. If you're the authorities, you stop this movement by showing the body. But no one did in a culture that honored tombs. Jonathan's mind conjured a silent, empty grave, its reality sharper now. And here's what hit me, Elon said, his voice dropping, pulling the room closer. The first witnesses were women. In first-century Jewish culture, their testimony wasn't valid in court. If you're making up a story, you don't choose women. A senator's aide clutched her tissue, her eyes unblinking. Jonathan felt a knot in his chest, awe and realization mingling. That detail, so inconvenient, felt like proof, raw and honest. All 4 accounts include this, Elon said, his voice firm. They were reporting truth, not crafting fiction. The logic was tight, each point sharp, and Jonathan found himself caught in its rhythm. And Peter, Elon said, a note of wonder in his tone. He denied Jesus under pressure from a servant girl. Yet weeks later, he's proclaiming to thousands that they killed the Messiah, that God raised him. Elon paused, letting the shift sink in. What changes a coward into a martyr? Not hope, not grief, only something real. Jonathan's hands rested still, a quiet fire burning within. Peter's transformation felt like a fact, not a story. The audience was a mix of reactions, some captivated, others uneasy. A filmmaker gripped her notepad, knuckles pale. But it's more than evidence, Elon said, his voice shifting personal. It's what happens when you live these teachings. Jonathan's gaze lifted, anticipation flickering. I started small, Elon said, a smile breaking through. Jesus said, love your enemies. So I prayed for my critics, my rivals, not just words, but for their peace, their healing. A producer shook his head, the idea foreign in a cutthroat world. Jonathan felt a spark of connection, recalling times he tried to forgive. It was hard, Elon admitted, his voice raw. Every instinct said fight. But I kept at it. In the anger, it started to fade. Not because they changed, but because I did. The room was silent, heavy with reflection. Jonathan's resolve deepened, sensing Elon was leading them towards something greater. The Austin Hall thrummed with quiet intensity, Elon's words a bridge between evidence and experience. Jonathan Roumie sat forward, his shoulders relaxed, but his gaze steady, a sense of grounding taking root. The idea that forgiving enemies could change you, not them, felt like a revelation, both personal and universal. The audience sat wrapped their faces, a mix of awe and introspection. Elon stood center stage, his voice softer now, inviting the room into his discovery. That was just the start, Elon said, his tone confessional, almost vulnerable. When I tested Jesus' teachings, not as rules but as experiments, I found they work in ways that reshape you. Jonathan's breath slowed, a quiet surge of purpose stirring. He'd lived these teachings in his own way, but Elon's lens, practical results-driven, made them feel alive, urgent. Elon paced, gesturing as if sketching a design. I tried another teaching, he said, a faint smile breaking through. Jesus said, "Give to everyone who asks." So I carried cash, gave it to those in need, not to fix the world, but because he said so. A venture capitalist shifted, uneasy with the idea. Jonathan felt a connection, recalling quiet acts of giving, the lightness they brought. And every time Elon sat facing the crowd, something changed. I felt more human, more connected to what matters. The room was still, the air heavy with reflection. A screenwriter clutched her notebook, her eyes bright. But the real shift came when I saw his words not as advice. Elon said, his voice dropping, but as truths about reality, like laws you can't escape. Jonathan's fingers brushed his knee, a spark of clarity igniting. He'd seen the teachings as ideals, but this as a blueprint felt transformative. Take the Sermon on the Mount, Elon said, his tone charged with wonder. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he wasn't just consoling. He was describing how life works. Those who admit they don't know everything, they're open to truth. Jonathan's chest tightened, not with doubt, but with insight. His moments of uncertainty now felt like strength's paths to understanding. Blessed are those who mourn, Elon continued, for the world's pain, their own failures. They see reality clearly, work to mend it. A tech founder nodded, his skepticism softening. Jonathan felt a quiet ache, his own struggles reframed as bridges to truth. And the merciful Elon said, his eyes sweeping the crowd, they received mercy. It's a cycle, a law of existence. The audience leaned in, some clutching tissues, others wrapped, caught in the rhythm. It's like Jesus gave us the source code of reality? Elon said, his hands shaping the air. Align with it and life works, not because you're good, but because you're in sync. A filmmaker scribbled, trying to capture the idea. Jonathan's resolve deepened, the teachings, now a map for living. But here's what changed everything, Elon said, his voice softening, eyes glistening. If Jesus was right about how to live, if his words work, then maybe he was right about who he was. The room held its breath, the weight of the question settling. Jonathan's hands stilled, anticipation flickering. Jesus didn't point to a path, Elon said, his voice urgent. He said, "I am the way. Not truths, but I am the truth. Not life, but I am the life." A producer's brow furrowed, grappling with the claim. Jonathan felt a quiet electricity, the words striking deep. Either he was mad, Elon said blunt, or he was who he claimed. No in between. The audience was a mix of awe and unease, every listener caught. And his followers, Elon said, his voice rising. Practical men, skeptics, saw his humanity. Yet after his death, they died for what they saw. Jonathan's gaze lifted, a fire kindling within. The disciples' sacrifice felt like proof demanding a response. "So here's what I can't shake," Elon said, his voice a whisper commanding. "If his teachings work, if the evidence holds, what does that say about him?" The silence was heavy, and Jonathan knew the final answer was coming. The Austin Hall was a crucible, Elon's words, a fire reshaping every thought. Jonathan Roumie sat forward, his gaze unwavering, a quiet epiphany burning within. The question, if Jesus' teachings work, what does that say about who he was, hung like a challenge, personal and universal. The audience sat frozen, their faces a tapestry of awe, doubt, and quiet resolve. Elon stood center stage, his voice poised to deliver the final truth, the hall a silent witness to a moment that could change everything. Let's face it, Elon said, his tone clear, unyielding, like a scientist with undeniable proof. If Jesus' teachings work, if they hold up under scrutiny, if the evidence backs his story, then we can't ignore who he claimed to be. Jonathan's throat tightened, a sense of purpose grounding him. He'd wrestled with Jesus' identity, but Elon's logic, relentless, rooted in results, made it feel like a question, demanding an answer now. Elon paced his hands, clasped eyes sweeping the crowd. Jesus didn't just teach. He said things no one says unless they're true. I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He paused, the words heavy, unapologetic. Jonathan's breath steadied, a quiet clarity settling in. He'd pondered these claims, but hearing them stripped bare felt like standing before a truth too vast to sidestep. These aren't philosophers' words, Elon said, his voice rising. They're either madness or truth. A murmur stirred, faint but electric. A cultural critic adjusted her glasses, torn between doubt and intrigue. Jonathan understood the tension. Faith had always been a leap, but Elon's binary framing left no room for ambiguity. And look at his followers, Elon said, a note of awe in his tone. Fishermen, skeptics, men who saw his flaws. Yet after his death they died rather than deny what they saw, crucified, beheaded, stoned. Jonathan's hands rested still, a quiet fire blazing within. The disciples' sacrifice wasn't just a story, it was evidence unyielding. You don't die for a lie you know is false, Elon said, his voice fierce. They knew if they'd seen him alive. The room crackled, every listener caught in the weight of that truth. Jonathan's gaze locked on Elon, a tightening in his chest, not sorrow but certainty. But what sealed it for me, Elon said, his voice softening, eyes glistening, was living his words. I gave to those who asked, prayed for those who hurt me, embraced humility. Each time it worked, not because I'm holy, but because it's how reality is built. A tech founder nodded, his cynicism gone. Jonathan felt a surge of connection, recalling moments of mercy that freed him. Jesus' teachings aren't advice, Elon said, his voice rising. They're the operating system of existence. Follow them and you become who you're meant to be. The audience was riveted, some clutching notebooks, others staring, caught in the rhythm. Jonathan's resolve deep in the teachings, a call to live fully. So here's the question, Elon said, stopping, his voice a whisper commanding. If Jesus was right about life, if his story holds, what does that mean for us? For you, for me, for the world we're building? The silence was profound, a reckoning that stilled the air. A producer sat back, brow furrowed. A senator's aide dabbed her eyes. I'm not selling a belief, Elon said, earnest, pleading. I'm asking you to test it, see what it means. Because if Jesus was who he said, it changes everything how we live. Love, face the future. Jonathan's gaze held steady, a quiet epiphany taking root. He dedicated his life to Jesus' story, but this moment felt like a call to live it deeper. And that's what I can't escape, Elon said, his voice soft, unwavering. If Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are true, if they withstand every test, then he's not just a teacher. He's the one who holds reality's keys. The silence stretched, heavy, expectant. Jonathan's heart was steady, filled with a clarity both ancient and new, a challenge to live the truth he'd only begun to grasp, as the hall sat poised on the edge of a decision that could change them all.